mornings when silence feels heavier than sound, pressing gently like the weight of snowfall on a roof that's held too long, too quietly, without protest. That day, the sun filtered through the kitchen window just as it always did, warm, unassuming, touching the ceramic teapot that my mother polished every Sunday as if it held the rhythm of our family's heartbeats. My father, Professor Alaric Blackwood, sat in his usual chair, tracing the rim of his teacup with a fingertip, eyes unfocused, not on the book in front of him, but somewhere between memory and confusion. A liminal space where thoughts no longer arrived whole. I noticed his hand paused mid-air, as if forgetting the path it had taken every morning for decades. And in that stillness, something unspoken stirred beneath the surface. He had been a man of letters, of metaphors and sonnets, of lectures that drew crowds not for their content alone, but for the calm gravity of his presence. A presence that never faltered. He never raised his voice, never forgot a date, never missed a detail. But that morning, he asked me how to spell my name, and when I answered, he smiled with an emptiness that made the room feel suddenly hollow, like a church after a funeral, where echoes of reverence remain, but the spirit is gone. Mother said it was fatigue, age perhaps, or the stress of grading final papers. Speaking with the precision of someone building a narrative she desperately wanted to believe. Her voice never wavered, but her hands trembled slightly when she stirred the tea. And I, standing between their two shadows, felt something shift under my feet, something I could not yet name. In our family, nothing had ever been loud. Love was quiet, devotion even quieter. We didn't argue. We rearranged sentences. We didn't cry in public. We folded grief into our linens, tucked it between book spines and family recipes like a secret. So when the neurologist's words landed, degenerative, rare, inherited, they didn't echo. They fell like glass, silently and irreversibly. I remember the doctor's eyes more than his words, kind, deliberate, heavy with the kind of sympathy that is too practiced to be comforting, a gaze that had seen this unraveling before. He said there was no cure. He said it runs in families. He said we should prepare. Though for what exactly? He didn't say. Only that it would change everything. I looked at my father then, this man whose mind had once held entire libraries, and I realized I was watching the beginning of an erasure. Like someone gently rubbing out the lines of a beloved sketch. One stroke at a time, not in cruelty, but in inevitability. I told myself it was an anomaly, a misalignment of fate and biology. I told myself our family history was clean, documented, safe. But somewhere behind my ribcage, a thread had been pulled loose. And every breath since felt like it might unravel something deeper, something that didn't want to be found. We drove home in silence, the kind that doesn't comfort but consumes, expanding in the quiet spaces between us like mist. My mother held his hand, her thumb brushing over his knuckles as if trying to memorize their shape before they slipped away. I stared out the window and saw nothing, but felt everything. And as the house came into view, still, warm, untouched by diagnosis, I knew that peace had been disturbed in ways we couldn't yet name. That night, as the wind pressed softly against the glass like an unanswered question, I sat in my childhood room and looked at the old family albums, tracing the lines of smiles that once seemed unbreakable, etched into paper like promises. I no longer knew if they told the truth, or simply the version we could live with, the version that let us sleep. I whispered into the dark, not to be heard, but to feel the sound of my own voice threading through the quiet. Where does this story really begin? And the silence, for the first time in my life, answered back, not with comfort, but with something I couldn't unhear, something that would echo through every truth I thought I understood. It began with the scent of lavender and the faint clink of silver rings, the kind that old women wear when they want you to remember their hands. Aunt Ondine returned not with fanfare, but with the kind of presence that fills a room before a single word is spoken. Her coat smelling of rain, her eyes sharp with memories she hadn't yet decided to share. My mother stood frozen at the doorway for half a second too long before composing herself into the poised, domestic figure she always performed so perfectly. And in that delay, I saw something fracture. Ondine's voice hadn't changed. It was still soft, textured like parchment. But her words were no longer wrapped in nostalgia. At dinner, between spoonfuls of broth and the clicking of cutlery, she dropped phrases that sat like pebbles in our quiet. She was different back then. And you wouldn't believe how wild Serafina used to be. My mother laughed too quickly, her eyes darting to mine and then back to her plate, her forced lightness betraying a silent plea for me to let it pass without question. But the air had shifted. The rhythm of the house, once seamless and unspoken, had developed a strange hesitation, like a pianist missing a note yet continuing to play in a recital where every mistake is heard but not acknowledged. I began to listen not only to what was said, but to what was carefully omitted, names that went unspoken, years quietly erased, and a stillness in my mother's posture that made me wonder what truth had been folded into her apron seams. Ondine didn't press. She merely observed, which somehow felt more dangerous. She lingered in doorways, ran her fingers across photo frames as if searching for the parts of memory that photographs could not hold. And her silences grew heavier each evening, weighted with the tension of a story she might not be the one to tell. One night, I found her staring too long at a portrait of my parents, her expression not fond, but investigative, as though seeking to reconcile the math of memory with the math of feeling. That evening, as I passed the guest room, I heard them, Ondine's voice low and steady, tinged with something like regret. My mother replied in clipped fragments, each word deliberate, chosen like tools by someone diffusing a buried mine. I couldn't make out their words, but the tone was enough to suggest the past had begun to knock again, not loudly, but insistently, in ways neither of them could ignore. Later, in my room, the quiet was no longer soft. It had a structure now, a presence. I lay awake sensing the walls around me breathing differently, as if the house itself had changed its alignment. Not broken, but reconfigured, like old wood settling into new positions. And within that new pattern, I began to see clearly what I had only felt before. The past was not behind us. It had returned. It was here, shaping the shadows of every word left unsaid, waiting to be seen. Some truths do not arrive with a thunderclap. They creep, like mist under a door, settling in the corners of the mind with quiet certainty that refuses to be silenced. It was not a confession, not a revelation, but a series of fractures, subtle and cumulative, that began to unthread the fabric of certainty I once wore like a second skin, as if it were armor against ambiguity. In the days that followed Ondine's arrival, I found myself unable to look away from my mother. She moved through the house as she always had, measured, meticulous, carrying trays and refolding towels with a precision almost ritualistic. Yet beneath that choreography of calm, there was a new tension in her shoulders, something not quite sewn in the curve of her lips. It was like watching a painting you've known all your life start to crack along the edges, imperceptibly at first, until the image becomes a question. I began to trace the lines of our family's history, not in photo albums or stories, but in the stillness that had grown louder with every passing day. I pulled out old medical records, The family tree we once drew for a school project. Old letters tied with ribbon and tucked in a drawer that smelled of lavender and thyme. Searching not for answers, but for inconsistencies. Nowhere in that archive of belonging was there any mention, any whisper of a disease like the one unraveling my father, and in that omission, something louder than words began to speak, insistently, beneath the surface of every page. The architect in me sought symmetry. I measured names against dates, memories against documents, and what had once seemed like a well-built lineage now revealed hidden asymmetries, unexplained voids, and missing beams in a house I thought I understood from foundation to roof. It wasn't the lack of evidence that disturbed me, it was the precision of the erasure. The deliberate care with which facts had been folded away. Someone, somewhere, had chosen to cut away pieces not to forget, but to conceal. Mother noticed. Of course. Her eyes lingered on my hands when I held papers. Her questions came too quickly when I closed the study door behind me, and there was a faint caution in her voice. The kind that emerges when one's silence is being examined under light that exposes more than it softens. And yet she said nothing, only carried on with her routine. Polishing truths she hoped I'd never turn upside down or hold against the morning. At night, I found myself awake at odd hours, staring at the ceiling fan as it carved slow shadows across the walls, like time pacing with quiet resolve. I thought of bloodlines not as rivers, but as mirrored halls, some corridors reflecting what we choose to remember, others distorting what we choose to forget. And somewhere within those reflections, I began to see outlines that didn't match the frame I had always assumed was whole. Doubt is rarely loud. It arrives in stillness, sits in corners, watches your hands shake as you fold familiar laundry, and makes even the gentlest question feel like an intrusion into a life that never fully belonged to you. I chose not to confront, but instead to observe carefully, to wait deliberately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to gather meaning between its folds. But every breath I took in that house began to feel like inhaling unfinished sentences, suspended in air, waiting to land with the weight of what had always been unsaid. By the end of that week, I no longer saw my mother's silences as softness. I saw them as thresholds, guarded, deliberate, and deeply afraid of being crossed. And in crossing them, even just with thought, I felt a truth take root, not yet grown, not yet named, but there all along, waiting for me to look closely enough and finally, irrevocably. See? Some choices do not come from clarity, but from pressure, slow, building, invisible to the eye, yet pressing down on the chest until the breath becomes deliberate. I didn't decide to seek the truth as much as I became unable to keep pretending I didn't hear it whispering behind every closed door in that house. There is a point where silence no longer protects. It imprisons. And I had lived too long inside walls I didn't build, but had inherited like a story missing its last page. I began to read. Not fiction, but genomes and patterns, codes of life instead of lines of prose, not letters between lovers, but long studies on genetic transmission, medical anomalies, and inherited neurological decay that charted a different kind of inheritance. The architecture of blood was far more complex than any floor plan I had ever drawn, and yet it felt familiar. This tracing of lines, this decoding of something invisible, but binding, and more intimately designed than any blueprint. I searched not only for symptoms, but for silence. The things my family never said, never wrote down, never acknowledged aloud. And I found that void more terrifying than any diagnosis. At night, I stared at the lamp beside my father's bed, watching the shadow it cast against the wallpaper curl and uncurl like a living thing with a rhythm of its own. He slept fitfully, murmuring fragments of lectures, lines of Yeats and Frost tangled in dreams that no longer belonged fully to this world. Sometimes he'd call my name. Sometimes a name that was not mine, but perhaps belonged to someone from a time I never knew. It wasn't fear I felt then, but something colder, something more exacting, a quiet, cold gulf where once there had been unquestioned belonging, and something in me began to untether from the illusion of origin. The internet became a terrain of quiet desperation and relentless search. I read testimonials from children who had discovered they were not biologically connected to their fathers, stories that mirrored my own hesitations. I watched interviews, documentaries, and academic case studies that unfolded one after another like silent confessions. They all had a moment, that turning point, when suspicion could no longer sit still and became action. I recognized that moment when I found myself on the website of a high-precision genetic testing center in Boston, my cursor hovering over the words, "Book a consultation," and when I finally clicked, it wasn't hesitation, it was inevitability. Collecting a sample from my father was not simple, nor cruel. It was careful, almost reverent. I made tea, handed him his favorite porcelain cup, waited until he had dozed off in the armchair, and gently retrieved the swab I had tucked into the sleeve of my cardigan as if it were part of an old, inherited ritual. I told myself it was science, logic, necessity. I told myself it was love in another form, not spoken but enacted. But part of me knew. It was the beginning of the end of our shared illusion, a truth I had begun to carve out of silence. I booked the appointment under a false name and brought my own sample too, more out of ritual than necessity, but also as a kind of symmetry. The clinic was quiet, sleek, all glass and brushed steel, with the kind of hushed professionalism that makes grief feel like a protocol. The technician was kind, faceless in her efficiency, and when she asked if I wanted the results emailed, I said no. I needed to be there. I needed to hear the truth aloud. Not alone in a browser window, but in a room, with walls, with air, with weight. Back home. I said nothing of what I had done. My mother asked if I was working on a new project. I nodded, and left it at that. My father stared at the window, a fly trapped between glass and screen, tapping at freedom with a rhythm that mimicked my own unrest. I could hear his breath, shallow but steady, and wondered if he knew something too, if his mind, unraveling as it was, still guarded one final room, locked, unspoken, sacred. That night, I lay in bed, eyes open, seeing not the ceiling but a map of fractures, hairline cracks stretching from one corner of my world to the other. Some choices are not born from courage. Some are born from a quiet surrender to what cannot be unlearned, what rises despite all efforts to bury. I did not choose to search because I stopped loving them. I chose to search because love, true love, cannot live in the dark. And when I closed my eyes, it was not fear that visited me, but the awareness that what I had set in motion would bring light. And light, though harsh, never lies. There are moments when time ceases to be linear. It folds, trembles, becomes breathless. The room at the genetic center was neither cold nor warm, just clinically still, a container for truths too dense for ordinary air. The walls, bare and soft gray, didn't judge, but held the silence like a bowl holds water, carefully, as if one word too loud might spill it all. I sat across from a woman who had read hundreds of these before, whose voice carried the gentle detachment of someone trained not to bruise with information. She explained the data, charts, percentages, sequences, her words moving like thin rivers over stone, smooth but incapable of softening what they carried. I nodded at all the science, all the carefully structured logic, though I barely heard it. I was not listening for the explanation. I was waiting for the knife to arrive in words, not gestures. And then it came. Not shouted, not whispered, but simply placed into the space between us like an object of quiet devastation that changed everything without lifting a sound. Based on the comparative analysis, she said, we did not find a biological match consistent with a paternal relationship between you and Mr. Alaric Blackwood. The sentence arrived not as a shockwave, but as a collapse, inward and slow, like a building whose foundation gives way in silence. I didn't cry, not immediately, because the grief had not yet found its shape. It hovered, undefined, just beneath the surface of my breathing. I stared at her lips as though they had formed a new alphabet I didn't know how to read. And somewhere, a part of me had always known, or at least feared, that this was the truth I had been circling for weeks. But to know in theory and to hear in clarity are different terrains. To hear is to lose the luxury of doubt, to have it stripped from your hands without warning. She handed me the papers, an envelope containing proof, or perhaps a mirror, depending on how you held it against the light. I didn't open it, because I didn't need to. The truth had already taken residence in my chest, silent but heavy. My hands, cold and foreign, folded it into my coat pocket, as if tucking away a letter from a future that had already come and gone. I thanked her with a voice that felt borrowed from a steadier version of myself. Walking home through Boston's late autumn streets, the wind sharper than memory. I noticed how unchanged the world seemed. Cars passed, coffee steamed in cafe windows. Children laughed into scarves too big for their faces, all oblivious to the rupture that had just taken place. It struck me then how the world does not pause for private grief, how revelation is always solitary, even when it should be shared among those who made you. There is no echo for what you cannot say aloud, no reflection for what refuses to appear in the mirror. At home. The door creaked open as it always had, with a familiarity that now felt both comforting and unreal. My mother was in the kitchen, stirring soup with the precision of someone who believes in routine as a form of redemption, and she asked about my day while keeping her back to me. I said it was long, not a lie, just not the whole truth, and my father sat in the living room, eyes tracking the patterns in the rug as though they might rearrange into answers if he stared hard enough. I looked at him and felt both infinite closeness and impossible distance wrapped in the same silence. That night, I stood in the bathroom, holding the envelope, letting it weigh my hands down like a stone pulled from the deep, and though I did not open it, its presence spoke. I simply watched my reflection, my face, my eyes, my hairline, searching for a man I had never met and might never find. There was no thunder, no weeping, no fracture loud enough to be named, just a stillness that felt final, like a door closing without sound. A silence too whole to be broken by language. Truth has a texture. It is not always jagged, not always violent. Sometimes it is soft, like wool soaked through, clinging, inescapable, and no less heavy for its quiet. I folded the envelope again, placed it in the drawer beneath my journals, and closed it gently, not hidden, not displayed, just placed, as one might set down a heavy book after reading the last line. And in that quiet, a part of me began to understand that what I had lost was not blood, but the fiction of certainty. And that, in itself, is a kind of beginning. For beginnings are often dressed as endings, and the real loss is not the truth, but the years spent afraid of finding it. There are bonds built not from inheritance, but from repetition, from the way one person waits for another to finish a sentence, from the way hands reach out before words form. That week, the silence between us stretched longer, heavier, no longer empty but filled with things that would never be said. And yet, in that quiet, something else began to move, not loud, not quick, but constant, like the slow return of warmth to cold skin. My father, Mr. Alaric Blackwood, grew more forgetful, more withdrawn, as though retreating into a landscape only he could see. He would sit for hours by the window, watching leaves fall like secrets no longer needing to be kept. One afternoon, he turned to me, his eyes clouded but soft, and said, "You always had your mother's patience," before drifting back into silence, unaware that I had never heard him say those words before. And somehow, that sentence became an anchor. I began reading to him again, old poetry, Shakespeare, snippets of lectures from his years at the university. At first, he barely reacted, but then, a slight smile would lift the edge of his lips, or his hand would twitch as though chasing a memory. In those moments, I stopped being the daughter who no longer belonged by blood and returned to being the child who had once sat on his lap while he recited Byron by heart. Memory, fragile as it was, held more truth than genetics ever could. In the soft light of evening, I brushed his thinning hair, helped him into bed, and listened to his shallow breathing. Each inhale a tether to this world, each exhale a quiet surrender. My mother watched from the doorway, a shadow in the hallway, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, her body tense as though bracing for a wave that never arrived. We spoke in fragments now, no longer performing grief, but simply inhabiting it, sharing a recognition of what had already been lost long before any results were spoken. One night, he reached for my hand, grasping it with more strength than I expected, and whispered, "You came back," not using my name, nor needing to, for in that moment, every memory stitched between us returned, clear and unchallenged. In that grip, there was a lifetime of good nights, school recitals, bandaged knees, and whispered lullabies, none of which had ever required a genetic map to be real. It was then that I knew I was his daughter in every way that mattered. The past could not be erased, nor rewritten, but it could be remembered differently, not as a betrayal, but as a mosaic of flawed love, of fear and protection, woven together like old yarn. My mother, once so composed, began to linger longer in the doorway, then in the room, then beside his chair. She touched his shoulder one morning and he looked at her, not with anger, not with blame, but with the gaze of someone remembering a field in spring, not the storm that followed. Love, when it is stripped of performance, becomes something quieter but more enduring. It is not a grand confession or a dramatic forgiveness, but the ritual of bringing tea at 4 in the afternoon, the tenderness of tucking the blanket without waking him, the diligence of washing his favorite sweater and folding it exactly how he liked. These small acts, repeated without expectation, became the language of redemption, and as I watched the two people who had raised me, flawed and fragile, finding their way back into each other's orbit, I realized that healing is not loud, it is not cinematic, it is slow, private, and most days, invisible, but it is real, and it is enough. If I had written it, the letter would have begun not with anger, nor even sorrow, but with a silence held too long. It would begin with the weight of everything unsaid, accumulated in corners no voice had reached. I would not ask why, because some questions are not meant to be answered, only carried like stones in the pockets of those who still walk the shoreline of memory, tracing old paths under new skies. I would tell you that there were nights I sat with the envelope unopened, imagining a different life, one where the truth was never needed because the love was always enough, in that imagined letter. I would not accuse you, nor beg for absolution, because blame has never built a bridge worth crossing. I would describe the way your hands shook when you stirred tea, even when you thought no one saw, and the way you watched father sleep, not as a wife might, but as someone standing beside a bridge she burned long ago and never rebuilt. I would write about the mornings that smelled like lavender and soap, and how I now understand that routine is sometimes the only scaffolding left when guilt has eaten through the foundation of everything stable. This letter would not be sent, because it is not meant to wound, nor to heal, but to witness something sacred in its unresolved state. It is meant to acknowledge without demanding reply, to hold space for what was never confessed. I would say not in fragments, but in full breath. I saw you. Always. I saw the woman behind the mother, the fear behind the silence, the grief behind the careful smiles crafted like armor. You were not the villain I once imagined, just a woman trying to survive the consequences of her choices without unraveling the threads that held everything together. For some truths are too heavy to be spoken without breaking something irreplaceable. I would tell you I was angry, not for what you did, but for the years you let me believe in a version of myself that was never real, a reflection crafted of hope and absence. I would admit that it felt like a theft. Subtle but enduring, to live as a daughter by name, not by truth, and to dream inside a story that did not belong to me. But then I would also tell you about the moments that followed, the ones where I learned to redefine family, not by origin, but by presence, not by birth, but by devotion shaped in the quiet acts of staying. And I would write of father, not in short declarations, but as a continuum, a thread that held even when unraveling, of how he became quieter, yes, but also kinder, as though the unraveling of his memory loosened something sacred, something that allowed love to bloom without explanation or boundary. There were days when the confusion deepened, his hands trembling more often, his sentences drifting midair, and I knew then that the truth, though necessary, had weighed heavily on his already fragile mind. I would tell you how I read to him, how his eyes followed my lips like they once followed poetry, and how I no longer cared whether he remembered the beginning, only that he stayed with me through the end. For what is fatherhood if not a constellation of small remembrances held in another's heart? This letter, still unwritten, would be my way of placing the past somewhere outside my chest, of acknowledging it without letting it define me, of creating space between the pain and who I am becoming. I would seal it not with ink, but with breath, the exhale after years of holding pain too tightly, and finally allowing it to shift into something bearable. And I would place it in the drawer with the test result, not to hide, but to rest, as we place old photographs between pages, not to forget, but to remember differently, because some words are too sacred for paper, too alive for binding. Some truths belong only to those who lived them, who survived them, who still wake each morning and choose to love in spite of them. This is not forgiveness. It is something quieter, more enduring. This is release, a love that asks for nothing, a memory that no longer burns but still glows, and maybe, in some corner of yourself, even without reading this, you already know. You already carry the letter I never sent, not as burden, but as echo. There is a quiet that settles in after a storm, not the hush of fear, but the hush of recognition, the kind that wraps around a home like an old shawl, frayed yet warm. Our days did not return to what they had been, nor did we pretend they could, but something gentler arrived, shaped not by the absence of pain, but by the decision to stay in spite of it. The house didn't laugh as it used to, but it no longer wept either. It simply breathed, slowly, like something healing beneath the surface. Father's condition no longer frightened me. It became a rhythm, an unfolding, a language without syntax but full of meaning. I learned to read his silences as one reads light across a wall, telling time not by minutes but by shadow and hue. There were moments when his eyes locked with mine and I knew, beyond all forgetting, that something eternal still anchored us, something no test result could name, something deeper than truth, quieter than blood. These were not grand moments. They were whispers in the ordinary, like the sound of his shoes beside mine, or the way he still hummed the tune to my childhood lullaby. Memory, it turns out, does not live only in the mind. My mother watched us, often from a distance, her hands always full but her eyes always elsewhere, as if afraid to look too closely at what might have been. There was no apology between us, but there was a new kind of presence, a willingness to remain in the room, to pour tea, to sit a little longer before reaching for distraction. I saw in her a woman unraveled, not by guilt alone, but by years of silence pressed like layers upon her chest. And perhaps, in those unspoken moments, she recognized in me not just a daughter she kept, but a mirror she avoided. We did not speak of the letter I never wrote, nor did we return to the day the truth arrived like a fault line beneath our feet. Instead, we existed differently, as one walks through a forest after fire, careful, reverent, aware of the roots still smoldering beneath the soil. Our family was never whole again, but it became honest. And sometimes, that is the only healing we are given. I began to draw again, not blueprints, but lines without function, spaces that felt like breath woven through silence. I found in the act of creation not escape, but a reckoning, a return to a part of myself that knew how to build even from ruins. The structures I drew were flawed, asymmetrical, open to the sky that once held so many questions, yet I no longer needed perfection, only presence, walls that held, even if uneven. My hand no longer sought certainty, only connection that lives not in the line, but in the courage to begin again. For even broken foundations can hold the weight of return. And in those twilight hours, when the light slants just so, casting gold across the worn wood floors, I would find myself listening, not for words, but for continuity, for what stayed after everything else fell away. A laugh that rose and caught in the throat before dissolving, a touch remembered not by the skin, but by something older, deeper. A quiet resilience that pulsed through our home like wind through old windows that had learned to welcome it. We were not fixed, not saved, not even stable in the way the world defines. But we were still here, bound not by certainty, but by the grace of persistence, and in the staying. We became something new, not untouched by grief, but unbroken by it. This is what remains, not the facts, but the fidelity, not the story, but the staying. And maybe that is all memory ever was, not the perfect recollection of what once was, but the will to keep showing up for what still is. We didn't call it reconciliation, nor did we even name it, instead. It arrived quietly, like dusk slipping beneath the doorframe, soft and uninvited, but not unwelcome. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic apology, only the gentle erosion of resistance, as if grief itself had polished our sharp edges into something less capable of cutting. What remained between us wasn't forgiveness, but a kind of mutual surrender, where silence no longer accused, and presence no longer demanded payment. One evening, I found Father in the study, his eyes skimming a page with no meaning, his fingers resting on paper as if memory might seep through skin. He didn't speak a word, but when I knelt beside him and placed my hand over his fingers curled slowly, deliberately, around mine with a tenderness that needed no name. The gesture held no clarity, no conscious recognition. Yet it was enough to steady the air between us. In that moment, the space between us filled with something deeper than understanding, something I can only call love in its most enduring form. Wordless, weightless, unwavering. Later that night, I sat with Mother in the kitchen, the air thick with ginger and lemongrass, her hands chopping rhythm into the silence that pressed between us. I spoke not of the past, but of the dinner, the weather, the way Father had smiled earlier as if something had briefly returned to him. She nodded slowly, not looking up. But the motion of her knife slowed, and her voice, when it came, was not an answer but an offering that cut deeper than any confession. He always knew, Lyra, maybe not with words, but in the quiet. And it was then I realized, healing was not in the confrontation, but in the return to the daily act of being together. I watched my parents grow softer with one another, not as lovers reunited, but as two witnesses who had survived the same storm and chosen, despite everything, to stay near its eye. They shared fewer words now, but more time stretched between them like a long-held breath. She brushed his hair each morning with the same gentleness she once reserved for me, and he followed her with his gaze, as if her shape in the room was a map he never wanted to forget. In these gestures lived a quiet absolution, not of the past, but of the fear that it would always divide us. Some wounds don't close, but they stop bleeding when held with care. For myself, I began to understand that rebuilding doesn't mean returning to what was, but choosing, brick by broken brick, what comes next without expecting it to look the same. I returned to my studio, not because the ache had gone, but because it needed somewhere to rest outside my chest where the light could find it. My hands moved with a steadiness I didn't recognize, guided not by ambition, but by the need to honor what held me through the unraveling of everything I had once believed. I began to sketch a space that could breathe, that could break, and still remain beautiful in its imperfection. Grace, I discovered, is not perfection restored, but peace, chosen again and again in the quiet of what remains. And so we lived, not happily ever after, but deeply, deliberately, with fewer illusions and more light stretching into corners we once left untouched. We cooked side by side as if meals could stitch memory. We sat beneath windows that no longer creaked in protest. We waited for the mail, not with urgency, but with the softness of those who know that time is a gift. We forgot things and remembered others, not always the important ones, but enough to feel real. We mourned, not with ceremony, but in the shared glances that said, "Yes, I see you. I stayed because love asked me to." We became a family not defined by its secrets, but by the decision to remain, even when the truths had no tidy endings. This is what love looks like in the aftermath, not triumphant, not unscathed, but brave enough to keep opening the door with both hands steady. There is a certain kind of silence that visits near the end, not the kind born of absence or regret, but the hush that settles when something has been fully seen. It slips into the corners of everyday life like late afternoon light, golden and unhurried, tracing the outlines of memory in dust and breath. Our home, once the theater of withheld truths, now hummed softly with the presence of things made known. Not perfect, but whole in the way that only fragments, laid bare and accepted, can be. Father sits near the window most days now, his gaze far beyond what is visible, and yet always returning to us as if tethered by invisible thread. Sometimes, when the sun leans in, it catches in his silvered hair, and I see him not as the man unraveling, but as the story keeper, one who carried a truth not of blood, but of unwavering care. We no longer wait for clarity, we sit with him instead, holding the space between questions and answers like a room we no longer need to leave. In this stillness, I learn that memory is not the recording of what was, but the presence of what remains. I often find myself in quiet moments beside my drafting table, not drawing, but simply running my fingers across its worn surface as if touching the echoes of all I once planned to build, letting them remind me of the resilience buried beneath stillness. The blueprints are fewer now, less ambitious perhaps, but more honest, sketches of spaces where light matters more than lines, where what is held is less important than who it is held for. I no longer chase the towering, I seek the tender through every curve and softened edge. Home is not a structure, but a softness that refuses to withdraw. There are nights when I hear my mother hum an old song in the hallway, one I had forgotten until it found its way back through her lips, wavering but sure in its quiet determination. She doesn't know I'm listening, but I think she sings for herself, to remember who she once was beneath the roles, the choices, the silences she carried like folded linen in a drawer, and in that melody, faint, broken, and still reaching, I hear a kind of courage I never knew to ask for, but always needed. The bravest thing she ever did was stay, even when her past tried to pull her away. The seasons change with less urgency now, as if even time has learned to move slower in our house where every second is steeped in remembrance. We don't mark the days with milestones, but with moments, the warmth of a hand passed across the table, the way Father's eyes light up at the scent of cinnamon, the sound of rain echoing through the hall without anyone rushing to close a window. Each moment feels small, but when gathered, they weave something lasting and real. This is the memory we make, not a monument, but a tapestry of touch and presence, and sometimes, just before dusk, I find myself at the garden's edge, watching shadows stretch long and lean across the grass as if time itself were bowing in reverence. I used to think closure was a door shutting with certainty, a final chapter penned in bold and underlined. But I've come to know it as something far quieter, a window left open, the breeze shifting the curtains, a breath released without resistance, softer than endings, closer to beginnings. In that stillness, I see my father, my mother, and the girl I once was, no longer asking to be told who she is, only resting in the truth that she is loved beyond answers, and that, perhaps, is the only ending worth writing. The light doesn't dim to signal an end, it softens to show what's been held all along.